The following report contains disturbing information about the scourge of child sex trafficking in the United States. You may want to pause and return to listen when younger ears are no longer near. In the first installment of our Essence of Evil series, we reported the horrific scope of the trafficking of children for sex and the staggering demand that exists for it in this country. In part 2 of this difficult series, we examine how children, mostly girls, are targeted and lured into the sex trafficking world, and why there is such a demand for the perversion of sex with kids. Rutherford Institute President John Whitehead raised a great deal of awareness towards this problem last month in his column entitled Essence of Evil: Sex with Children Has Become Big Business in America. He also reported that children are purchased for sex more than 2 million times per year in the U.S. alone. But before that can happen, the traffickers must have the children to sell. How does that happen? Whitehead says in some cases, kids are taken in the blink of an eye.
These so-called workers, young workers, walk over driveways and start talking to girls, and a car pulls up and they snatch the girl off the driveway and they drive away with her. These girls go missing. I mean, if you read about it, even local communities here, small communities, girls are missing for months, days. Sometimes they don't find them. They're going into the sex trade business, which is, again, the most horrendous thing that I've ever seen on this planet.
And while that horror does happen far too often, Angela Offmuth of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children says modern-day traffickers often use more sophisticated means.
What we see more of here at the National Center is kids who are not necessarily specifically taken, but are more chosen and are more recruited into this crime, unfortunately. And while we do know that there are abduction scenarios that do happen and that do exist, what we see is that kids who are missing, are much more vulnerable to becoming victimized by this crime.
Offmuth says predators are very skilled at zeroing in on preteen and teenage girls who reveal discontentment with their lives.
These traffickers prey on kids who are vulnerable, meaning they know that there are kids out there who have certain needs to be met. And so I would say kind of the common threads of these individuals who are preying on these kids are people who are looking for children who have a need that needs to be filled.
And Offmuth says predators and traffickers convince these kids they can make their lives better.
They see a child who is talking about maybe being lonely, maybe things not going so well at home, whatever that might be. They may try to reach out to that child and try to fill that sort of void of affection that child is missing. You know, for kids who are on the streets, who have run away or have been kicked out of their homes for various reasons, we know that those kids, they have a lot of needs that aren't being met.
As Offmuth said, the most likely place for all this to happen is on the Internet. Donna Rice Hughes is president of Enough is Enough, an organization that works to protect kids online and has since the Internet went mainstream in the 1990s. Hughes says the web is ground zero for these predators.
There was just a report that came out last year, the 2018 Federal Human Trafficking Report, that has now documented that the Internet is the most dominant business model that sex traffickers use to not only solicit buyers of commercial sex, but also to lure victims.
According to that 2018 Federal Human Trafficking Report, nearly 43% of sex trafficking victims are lured through the Internet. And more than 87% of all communication between traffickers and customers who pay to rape children is done online. Hughes also says the online luring of children can take different forms, from the filling of needs as described by Offmuth to those curious enough to engage with sexual flirtations on the Internet.
So that could be any listener right now who has maybe a preteen girl, a daughter, or a teenager who is using the Internet and meets someone online. They start to engage in a sexual conversations. This is very common. Sexting may occur, that type of thing. Sometimes, the young girl will get so bonded to this person that she'll go off and be with them. Some of these predators are actually traffickers, and they can lure them that way.
Once the child is convinced to run away from home, lured off the streets, or even abducted, the traffickers then seek to groom their victims to become part of their trafficking business. Angela Offmuth explains.
You know, you can come and stay with me for a few days, and then that's when a kind of grooming and recruitment process can begin, where you have a child who meets someone that seems like a pretty nice guy or gal, but then things start to change, and that person then begins to talk about, well, now that you're staying here, I'm going to need you to start bringing in some money. Or, we have this nice relationship going. If a boyfriend or girlfriend relationship has developed, maybe you could do this with my friend, and we can make a little money off this. It'll just be a one-time thing, but it turns into, unfortunately, something that is forced over and over and over again.
And Donna Rice Hughes says once that pattern is established, the traffickers put out the for sale sign.
Someone who is a child who is already being sold for sex can now be advertised for sex by their pimp, by their trafficker, to be sold over and over again.
This is happening all across the country, in big cities, suburbs, small towns, and in rural areas. According to John Whitehead, the Washington-Baltimore region on the East Coast is one of the wealthiest areas of the nation. And it's also a hotbed for sex trafficking, known as the Circuit, quote, with its I-95 corridor dotted with rest stops, bus stations, and truck stops as a hub for the sex trade. Offmuth says communities across the nation are often shocked to find out how openly sex with kids is advertised in their own backyards.
When we do law enforcement trainings all across the country, one of the things that we may do when we're in a specific location is, we'll just run a Google search, look at, online ad sites and see what's there for that area. And quite often people are surprised at how many ads there are and how easy it is for a person to go online and buy something like a boat or a couch or a child for sex, unfortunately.
The question that lingers for many, however, is where do these customers come from? In part one of this series, we explained how the perpetrators come from every demographic and every economic station. But why do they want to have sex with children? Donna Rice Hughes says we can once again point to the Internet for fueling these criminal desires.
The United States is the number one host of child pornography sites worldwide. Let me just take a minute on child pornography. Child pornography depicts an actual child being sexually abused or exploited, right? So the people who use and consume that type of pornography or child sex abuse images, it does not satisfy their desire to have sex with children. In fact, it actually fuels that desire.
And it also ties those two businesses together.
So it's this vicious circle. So when we look to deal with the sex trafficking industry, we have to not only deal with the supply side and those who are selling women and children for sex, but we have to look at the demand side. What's driving it? And one of the things we know that is driving it is pornography and child pornography. Not only that, victims of sex trafficking are used in this content.
And most of the rapists also know they're likely to get away with it. While tracking and arresting the traffickers often proves elusive, Offmuth says prosecuting the customers is even more difficult.
It's tough because quite often law enforcement is more focused on the prosecution of the traffickers, and the demand is something that is another kind of issue as far as how each jurisdiction wants to deal with that.
In our final installment of Essence of Evil, we'll look towards solutions. How can you best protect your kids? And what can lawmakers and law enforcement do better to help put an end to this horrific problem? For Radio America, I'm Greg Corombos.